Welcome to cozy mystery stories, where the genteel facade of society often conceals its darkest secrets. Our case unfolds within the hallowed, mahogany-panelled walls of the Imperial Club in London, a bastion of colonial nostalgia. Here, amidst cigar smoke and self-congratulatory tales of adventure, a group of members finds themselves ensnared by a suffocating London fog and a murder most foul, proving that the sins of the Empire have a long and vengeful memory. The fog came down upon St. James's like a shroud, not the clean, white mist of a country morning, but a thick, ochre-coloured miasma that clung to the gaslights and turned the familiar London streets into a bewildering labyrinth. It pressed against the tall, plate-glass windows of the Imperial Club with a silent, insistent weight, blurring the world outside into a formless, sulphur-yellow gloom. Inside, however, the world was unchanged, a perfect time capsule of mahogany, worn leather, and the faint, lingering scent of decades of cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. The hands of the great clock in the hall stood, as they always did, at 6:15, though whether it was morning or evening, one could no longer tell by the light. For the members of the Imperial Club, time was not so much a progression as a fixed state of being, a comfortable monument to a past they had helped to build and whose glories they never tired of recounting. Ah, but my dear reader, the truth is often disguised in the ordinary, and a club, however exclusive, is merely a collection of people. And people, as I have found, are rarely as simple as they appear. I myself am not a member, of course. Such establishments are not, shall we say, overly progressive in their admissions policies. But I have my sources. A quiet word here, a discreet observation there, and the little grey cells can piece together a great deal. On this particular evening, the fog had rendered the club an island, marooned in the heart of London. The doors were barred not by any lock, but by the impenetrable wall of vapour. No one could get in, and more to the point, no one could get out. A perfect closed space, you see, the sort of setting that can make secrets very nervous indeed. In the centre of the smoking room, holding court from the depths of a cavernous Chesterfield armchair, was Major General Alastair Fitzwilliam. He was a man built on a large scale, large of belly, large of voice, and possessed of a confidence so vast it left little room for anyone else. His face was a florid map of fine brandy and tropical suns, his moustache a magnificent, bristling affair that seemed to enter a room a full second before he did. He was, at that moment, deep into one of his favourite sagas, the quelling of the Kerinci Valley uprising in British Malaya, circa 1912. Barely a company of men, I tell you, he boomed, splashing a little more brandy into his glass. The firelight glinted off the heavy signet ring on his finger. Just a handful of stalwart lads against a horde of fanatics. They came at us with their parangs and their poisoned darts, screaming like banshees, but we held the line. Gave them a taste of British steel. Around him, his audience sat in various states of polite endurance. One must always consider the little grey cells, and a study of faces in a moment like this can be most revealing. Mr. Alastair Finch, a retired classics professor, sat slightly apart from the main group. He was a small, neat man, with a mind as orderly as his precisely knotted tie. He watched the general not with admiration, but with the quiet, analytical gaze of an entomologist studying a particularly noisy beetle. He saw the subtle flicker of discomfort in the others, the small tells that spoke volumes. Lord Harrington, the club's chairman, for instance, a man whose spine seemed to have been permanently fused into a posture of ramrod dignity, he cleared his throat with a dry little cough. "Quite the adventure, Alastair," he murmured, his tone suggesting the subject was perhaps best retired. Lord Harrington's concern was always for the club's decorum, and the general's tales often strayed into the unpleasantly graphic. But Mr. Finch noted the nervous way his lordship's fingers drummed upon the arm of his chair, a frantic, silent rhythm that betrayed an anxiety deeper than mere social discomfort. Then there was Mrs. Elena Vance. As the widow of a respected member, she was afforded the rare privilege of access to the smoking room. She was a woman of quiet elegance, dressed in shades of grey that complemented the perpetual sorrow in her eyes. At the mention of the Kerinci Valley, all colour drained from her face, and her hand trembled so violently that the sherry in her glass threatened to spill. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet revealed too little. Her late husband, Captain Vance, had served under Fitzwilliam. He had not returned from Malaya. In stark contrast sat Mr. Gideon Thorne, a journalist with a pen as sharp as his features. He made no secret of his contempt, his lip curled in a permanent sneer as the General spoke. Thorne was at the club under sufferance, ostensibly to interview Fitzwilliam for a book one suspected would not be a hagiography of imperial heroes. "A taste of British steel," Thorne interjected, his voice dripping with acid. "Is that what we are calling it these days? I believe the official report mentioned the burning of a village." Fitzwilliam's face purpled. "The place was a hotbed of sedition, necessary measures, Thorne. Something you, with your ink-stained fingers and your Bolshevik sympathies, could never understand." From a quiet corner, a pair of knitting needles clicked with a soft, metronomic rhythm. Miss Beatrice Holland, a missionary home on leave from Africa, seemed oblivious to the rising tension. She was a mousy, unassuming woman in her late 40s, her gaze fixed upon the complex pattern of the grey wool in her lap. She seemed as out of place in this masculine sanctuary as a field mouse in a lion's den, yet there was a stillness about her, a self-containment that was almost unnatural. Observing them all was Dr. Arbuthnot, a retired physician who had spent 30 years in India. He was a man of science, precise and detached. He swirled the amber liquid in his own glass, remarking to no one in particular, "The jungles of the Malay Peninsula are a veritable pharmacopoeia. So many fascinating alkaloids, so many plants that can kill or cure with equal efficiency." His comment hung in the air, a strange and morbid counterpoint to the General's bluster. And finally there was Thomas, the steward. Young, impassive, he moved through the room with a ghost-like efficiency, refilling glasses, stoking the fire, his presence so constant as to be almost invisible. But he heard everything. His face was a mask of deference, but Mr. Finch, a keen observer of the human condition, detected a deep, cold anger banked in the boy's eyes. "Nonsense about a village fire," Fitzwilliam roared, dismissing Thorne with a wave of his hand. He was now on his feet, his bulk casting a large shadow in the firelight. "We secured the area, recovered the Sultan's treasure they had stolen, and put an end to the affair. A damned fine piece of work." He drained his glass. "Thomas, another brandy, and I shall take it in the library. The company in here is becoming decidedly morbid." Thomas bowed his head. "Very good, sir." The General strode from the room, leaving a vacuum of silence in his wake. The tension, however, remained. Mrs. Vance had set her glass down, her hand pressed to her lips. Lord Harrington was staring into the fire, his face a study in grim preoccupation. Mr. Thorne merely smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. An hour passed. The fog outside seemed to have grown even thicker, muffling the very sounds of the city. The rhythmic click of Miss Holland's needles was the only sound, a strangely domestic counterpoint to the oppressive atmosphere. It was Thomas who broke the spell. He re-entered the room, his professional calm finally shattered. His face was ashen. "My lord," he said, his voice a strained whisper directed at Lord Harrington, "it's the General." "I went to the library to see if he required anything." He swallowed hard. He is not moving, my lord. I believe he may be unwell." Dr. Arbuthnot was on his feet at once, grabbing the small leather bag he always carried. The others followed, a small, anxious procession, into the magnificent, book-lined silence of the club library. Major General Fitzwilliam was slumped in his favourite wingback chair by the cold, unused hearth. His head was lolled to one side, his jaw slack. The empty brandy glass had slipped from his fingers and lay intact on the thick Persian carpet. For a moment, it seemed as if he had simply fallen into a deep, brandy-induced sleep. but there was a profound and terrible stillness to him that went beyond sleep. Dr. Arbuthnot knelt beside the chair, his fingers going to the general's neck, then his wrist. After a long moment he looked up, his face grave. "He's gone," he announced quietly. "I'm very much afraid the general is dead." A collective gasp went through the room. Lord Harrington, looking pale and shaken, moved towards the telephone on the desk. He lifted the receiver. "I must call the police and his family." He jiggled the receiver hook. "Operator, operator." He turned back to the room, his expression one of dawning horror. "The line is dead. The fog must have brought down the wires." They were trapped in the silent, opulent tomb of the club, with the dense, suffocating fog as their jailer and a dead man in their midst. Dr. Arbuthnot had leaned closer to the general's face. "This is most irregular," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "There is a faint, almost imperceptible odor like bitter almonds." He gently tilted the general's head. On the side of the thick, fleshy neck, almost hidden by the collar, was a small, angry red mark, as if he had been strung by an insect. And look at the lividity of the skin. This was no simple cardiac arrest. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the silent, frightened faces. "I cannot be certain without a proper examination, of course. But my professional opinion is that Major General Fitzwilliam did not die of natural causes. I believe he was poisoned." The word fell into the profound silence of the library, and in that moment the opulent room ceased to be a sanctuary. It became a cage containing 6 people, one of whom it now seemed certain was a murderer. "Mr." Finch stepped forward, his quiet demeanor a stark contrast to the rising panic. "In that case," he said, his voice calm and precise, "we find ourselves in a most unfortunate yet clear predicament. We are isolated, with no means of contacting the authorities. A man has died under suspicious circumstances. And the person responsible is, by necessity, still in this club." He looked from one face to another, his gaze lingering for just a fraction of a second on each. "It would be prudent, I believe, to establish the facts before the situation deteriorates." Lord Harrington, though visibly shaken, clung to the familiar tenets of order and procedure. "Deteriorates? My dear Finch, we are civilized people. We shall simply wait for the fog to lift and for the police to arrive." "And in the meantime," Gideon Thorne countered, his voice sharp with a cynical amusement, "the murderer has ample opportunity to cover their tracks or perhaps to continue their work. Is that not so?" The suggestion hung in the air, chilling the room more effectively than any draught. The idea that the night's work might not be done sent a fresh wave of fear through the assembled company. It was Mr. Finch's quiet logic that prevailed. "Mr. Thorne has a point, my lord. While we must not overstep our bounds, we have a duty, to the general and to ourselves, to preserve any evidence and to understand what has transpired. We cannot allow emotion to cloud our judgment. Ah, the supreme importance of the little grey cells. In moments of crisis, they are one's only true allies. And so, with a reluctant nod from Lord Harrington, Mr. Finch assumed the unofficial role of investigator. His first act was one of simple prudence. "Thomas," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "please lock this room. No one is to enter until the police can be summoned." The general must remain undisturbed. Thomas, his face still pale, nodded numbly and pocketed the heavy brass key. The body was now sealed away, but its presence was a palpable weight upon the whole establishment. They retreated to the smoking room, the scene of their last encounter with the living Fitzwilliam, and the atmosphere was thick with a suspicion that was as tangible as the fog outside. Each person looked at the others with new eyes, searching for the faintest crack in the facade of civilization. "Let us be methodical, Mr." Finch began, taking a seat not in a comfortable armchair, but on a hard-backed dining chair he had pulled into the center of the room, as if creating his own small island of reason. "The general was alive when he left us. He was found approximately 1 hour later. Dr. Arbuthnot suspects a poison, a fast-acting poison, presumably." "Indeed," the doctor affirmed. Given the circumstances, the onset must have been swift. He would have felt little. A moment of dizziness, perhaps, followed by paralysis of the respiratory system. It would have appeared much like a sudden seizure or heart failure to the layman. And the means of administration, Mr. Finch pressed. The brandy is the most likely candidate, Dr. Arbuthnot mused. A colourless, tasteless poison could easily be mixed with the spirit. The brandy, Mr. Finch repeated thoughtfully. Thomas, you poured the General's drink. The young steward flinched as all eyes turned to him. Yes, sir, just as he asked, from the decanter on the sideboard. The same one everyone else has been drinking from all evening. And did you see anyone approach the decanter, or the General's glass after you had poured it? Thomas shook his head. No, sir, I poured it and he took it from me directly. He walked straight out of the room. This presented a puzzle. If the decanter was untainted, the poison must have been introduced into the glass itself. But when, and by whom? Mr. Finch's gaze swept the room. Let us consider another, more delicate matter. Motive, Mr. Thorne, you made no secret of your disdain for the General. The journalist gave a humorless laugh. Disdain, my dear sir, that is an understatement. Fitzwilliam was a butcher and a braggart who personified the worst excesses of the British Empire. My book intends to expose him as such. I have a file thick with his misdeeds. Does that give me a motive? Of course. I wanted to destroy his reputation, not his person. A dead martyr is far less useful to me than a living, disgraced scoundrel. His logic was cold, but it had a certain brutal sense to it. To kill Fitzwilliam would be to silence his most valuable source of infamy. Mr. Finch nodded slowly, accepting the statement at face value for the moment. He then turned his mild gaze upon Mrs. Vance, who sat twisting a handkerchief in her lap. Mrs. Vance, the mention of the Kerinci Valley appeared to distress you greatly. She looked up, her eyes swimming with a sorrow that seemed both old and freshly wounded. My husband, Robert, he died in that valley, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The official report said he was killed in action, a hero's death. And you do not believe that is what happened? Mr. Finch prompted gently. A single tear traced a path down her powdered cheek. Robert was a good man, a cautious man. He wrote to me, his letters were circumspect, but he spoke of his commanding officer's recklessness, his vanity. He said Fitzwilliam's ambition was going to get them all killed. Her voice broke. His last letter arrived a week after the telegram informing me of his death. In it, he said he had uncovered something terrible about the Kerinci incident, something that went far beyond a simple military action. He said Fitzwilliam was a coward and a criminal. She looked up, a flash of steel in her grief-filled eyes. So, yes, Mr. Finch, I despised General Fitzwilliam. I believe he was responsible for my husband's death. A motive of vengeance, deep and keenly felt, more powerful perhaps than any professional animosity. The interrogation, for that is what it had become, moved on to Lord Harrington. The chairman bristled at the implication. This is preposterous, Finch. I have known Alastair for 30 years. We were members here together. Why on earth would I wish him harm? And yet you seemed most anxious when he began his story, Mr. Finch observed mildly. As if there was something in his tale you did not wish to have told. Lord Harrington's face tightened. He seemed to age 10 years in that moment. He glanced around the room at the faces of his fellow members, as if weighing the cost of a secret. Very well, he sighed, his dignity crumbling. There are matters of business, old business, that connect my family to that part of the world. My grandfather financed one of the first rubber plantations in that region. The region Fitzwilliam was pacifying, Thorne interjected, his journalistic instincts alight. The very same, Harrington admitted miserably. There were irregularities, disputed land claims. Fitzwilliam knew the sordid details. He has, from time to time, reminded me of that fact. He was financially embarrassed of late. He implied that a significant contribution to his fortunes would ensure his continued discretion. Blackmail, another classic motive. The esteemed Lord Harrington, a pillar of society, being bled dry by a man who knew the tainted source of his family's wealth. Throughout this, Miss Holland's needles had not ceased their quiet clicking. Mr. Finch turned to her. "And you, Miss Holland, you are very quiet. Did you know the General?" She started, as if woken from a trance. "Oh no, goodness no, I never met the man before this evening. I am only here as a guest. I am waiting for my brother, a member who was to meet me. The fog must have delayed him." She seemed utterly terrified, a small bird caught in a room full of cats. She offered nothing more, her gaze dropping back to her knitting as if it were a shield. Mr. Finch let his eyes rest upon her for a moment longer than was comfortable before turning to the doctor. "Doctor Arbuthnot, you mentioned the pharmacological wonders of the Malayan jungle. Do you have any specific knowledge of poisons from that region?" The doctor polished his spectacles, a gesture that gave him a moment to compose his thoughts. "My specialty was tropical diseases, not toxicology. However, any physician with experience in the East learns a little of the local flora. I have read, for instance, of the latex of the ipo tree, used by the indigenous people for their blowpipe darts. And there are various species of strychnos, which yield potent neurotoxins. A minuscule amount introduced into the bloodstream would be fatal." "Introduced into the bloodstream," Mr. Finch repeated, his brow furrowed. "But we have been assuming the poison was ingested." "It is merely a possibility," the doctor said smoothly. "But that small mark on his neck, it is curious, is it not? It resembles a puncture wound, almost as if from a thorn or a fine needle." This new theory shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. A poison that had to be injected was a far more difficult proposition than one simply slipped into a drink. It required proximity, a moment of distraction, and a very specific delivery mechanism. Mr. Finch recalled the General swatting at his neck shortly before he left the room. Had he complained of a fly, an insect bite? The memory was tantalizingly vague. His mind was a whirl of possibilities. He decided a search was in order. A search for what, he was not entirely certain, but the little grey cells demanded more data. He proposed they examine each other's belongings. It was a flagrant breach of etiquette, but fear is a powerful solvent of social norms. After a moment of stiff protest from Lord Harrington, they consented. Thorne's briefcase yielded the expected, a thick file of damning research on Fitzwilliam's career, filled with accounts of brutality and corruption. It was a motive in print, but as he had argued, not necessarily for murder. In Mrs. Vance's handbag, tucked into a side pocket, they found a small leather-bound diary. It was her late husband's. With trembling hands, she allowed Mr. Finch to read the final entry. It described in horrified detail the massacre of the Kerinci villagers and Fitzwilliam's theft of a sacred tribal artifact, confirming Thorne's accusations and her own suspicions. It was a heartbreaking testament, and it solidified her place as a prime suspect. Dr. Arbuthnot's medical bag contained the usual assortment of vials and instruments. Mr. Finch noted a small bottle of digitalis, a heart medication. "For a recurring arrhythmia of my own," the doctor explained calmly, though the presence of any potential poison did not go unnoticed. The search of Miss Holland's knitting bag revealed nothing but balls of wool, her half-finished grey scarf, and a well-thumbed Bible. She was the picture of innocence. Lord Harrington and Thomas, the steward, had nothing of interest on their persons. The exercise had revealed much about motive but little about means. Frustrated, Mr. Finch decided to conduct a more thorough search of the public rooms. In the games room he found nothing, but in the library, now unsealed for a methodical search before being locked again, he made a small but significant discovery. Tucked away on a high shelf was a dusty display case of colonial artifacts. Among them was a long, slender blowpipe from Borneo, and beside it a small quiver for darts. One of the darts was missing. He was contemplating this when Thomas approached him. "Sir," the steward said, his voice low. "There is something else, the book, the one from the botany section." "What about it?" "It's gone, sir. A large green volume. flora of the Malayan Peninsula. I noticed it was missing this afternoon. General Fitzwilliam had been looking at it last week. I thought he might have taken it to his chair, but it is not here. A missing book on Malayan plants, a missing blowpipe dart. A victim with a puncture wound on his neck, dead from what was likely a poison derived from a Malayan plant. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. The murderer was not just angry, they were knowledgeable and meticulously prepared. Suddenly, a cry from the main hall shattered the quiet. Then came the unmistakable smell of smoke. The polite facade of their captivity was burning away, revealing the raw panic beneath. Someone shouted, "Fire!" The cry of fire acted as a powerful catalyst, transforming the simmering pot of suspicion into a boiling cauldron of chaos. The smoke, thin and acrid at first, was billowing from beneath the cellar door. Thomas, reacting with an instinct born of his profession, grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, while Lord Harrington, his face a mask of apoplectic horror at this fresh assault on his sanctuary, fumbled to raise the alarm, forget. Ting once more that the telephone was dead. In the ensuing confusion, as the members scattered in a panic, a singular event occurred, almost unseen. Mr. Finch, whose habit of observation never deserted him, noticed a shadowy figure dart towards the corner where Mrs. Vance had left her handbag. In the swirling smoke, the figure snatched at the bag, but its strap caught on the arm of the chair. At that exact moment, Thomas, having abandoned the cellar door as a lost cause for the moment, turned and saw the act. "Here, what do you think you're doing?" the steward yelled, his voice cracking. The perpetrator, startled, let go of the bag and melted back into the thickening haze. The entire incident lasted no more than a few seconds, but its implications were profound. Mr. Finch's mind seized upon it. The fire, he realized, was no accident. It was a diversion. And its target was not the club itself, but the contents of Mrs. Vance's handbag, her late husband's diary. Someone desperately wanted to possess or destroy that book. Was it Mrs. Vance herself, creating a panic to dispose of evidence that incriminated her? Or more likely, was it someone else, trying to remove the one piece of physical evidence that explicitly named the Kerinsai Valley and its horrors? The fire itself proved to be more smoke than flame, a pile of oil-soaked rags in the wine cellar that was quickly subdued by Thomas and Dr. Arbuthnot. But it had served its purpose. Nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The veneer of civilized decorum was gone, replaced by raw, undisguised fear and accusation. "It was Thorne," Lord Harrington declared, his face smudged with soot. "The man is an anarchist. He is trying to destroy us all." "Don't be a fool, Harrington," the journalist shot back. "Why would I burn my own evidence? It was you trying to create a panic to hide your own guilt." It was into this maelstrom of recrimination that Mr. Finch stepped. He had retrieved something from the library before it was relocked. He held it up for all to see. It was a single, small, wickedly sharp thorn, no bigger than a fingernail, which he had found embedded in the plush carpet near the general's chair, a discovery he had kept to himself until this moment. "I believe it is time," he announced, his quiet voice cutting through the clamour, "that we stopped shouting and started thinking." He gestured for them all to sit, and such was the authority in his tone that they obeyed, their anger momenta. Riley quelled by a desperate need for answers. They gathered in the hall, the smell of smoke still hanging heavy in the air, and Mr. Finch stood before the grand fireplace, a small, unassuming man about to perform an act of extraordinary mental acrobatics. "We have been looking at this affair all wrong," he began, placing the tiny thorn on the mantelpiece. "We have focused on who would want General Fitzwilliam dead. The truth is, almost everyone in this room had a reason, a motive, as the police would say." He addressed them one by one, his logic calm and inexorable. "Lord Harrington, you were being blackmailed over the sordid origins of your family's fortune. Mr. Thorne, you wished to expose the general as a fraud and a war criminal. Mrs. Vance, you held him responsible for the death of your husband. Any one of you possessed a motive of sufficient strength, He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But a motive is not enough. One must also have the means and the opportunity. We have been working under the assumption that the poison was administered in the brandy. But the brandy came from a communal decanter. To poison the glass would require an act of supreme stealth, unseen by anyone in a crowded room. It is possible but highly improbable. It is the only way, Dr. Arbuthnot insisted. No, Mr. Finch replied softly. It is not. You yourself, Doctor, provided the alternative. You noted the puncture wound. You spoke of poisons that must enter the bloodstream. You mentioned the latex of the ipo tree and the blowpipe darts of the native peoples. He turned his gaze to the display case in the corner of the hall, the twin of the one in the library. The club has a fine collection of such artifacts, and we know that a dart is missing from the library's collection. We also know that General Fitzwilliam, just before he left the smoking room, was heard to complain of what he thought was an insect bite on his neck. A collective intake of breath swept the room. The theory was outlandish, fantastical, and yet it fit the facts with a horrifying precision. The murderer did not poison the glass, Mr. Finch continued. They poisoned the man himself, right here in the smoking room in plain sight of us all. A tiny, poisoned thorn, fired from a small, concealable weapon, would have been all it took. The general, in his arrogance, would have dismissed the pinprick as a trifle. He then walked to the library under his own power, where the poison, a fast-acting neurotoxin, did its work. A perfect, almost untraceable crime, with a built-in alibi for the perpetrator, who never even entered the room where the body was found. The pieces were now falling into place. The missing dart, the puncture wound. The general's casual complaint. The fire, too, now made perfect sense. The attempt to steal Captain Vance's diary during the fire was not an act of a panicked murderer trying to destroy evidence against themselves, Mr. Finch explained. It was an act of misdirection. The murderer knew the diary implicated the general in the Kerintsai Valley affair. They feared that if the police focused on that event, it might lead them down a path that would eventually uncover the murderer's own connection to that place. The real killer wanted us to suspect Mrs. Vance or Mr. Thorne or Lord Harrington, anyone whose motive was already known. His gaze swept the room, past the stunned faces of Harrington, Thorne and Mrs. Vance. It passed over Dr. Arbuthnot and Thomas. And it came to rest in the quiet corner where the missionary sat. The clicking of the knitting needles had stopped. For the first time all evening, all eyes were on Miss Beatrice Holland. She sat frozen, her hands clutching the grey wool, her face a pale, terrified mask. "It is a clever plan," Mr. Finch said, his voice laced with a reluctant admiration. One that required immense patience, specific knowledge, and nerves of steel. The knowledge could be found in a book on Malayan flora, for instance, which has conveniently gone missing from the library. The patience required to wait years for the perfect opportunity for revenge, and the nerve to sit calmly knitting while your victim walks away to die. He took a step towards her. The fire was your only mistake. In the confusion, you thought you could retrieve the diary and remove the only other link to the Kerintsai Valley. But Thomas saw you. You are not a professional thief, and for a moment your composure failed you. He paused, his final words delivered with a quiet finality. But your greatest oversight was much smaller. When I examined the contents of your knitting bag, I found nothing. But just now, when I looked at your hands, I noticed a small, fresh scratch on your right index finger. A scratch perhaps from the tip of a very sharp, poisoned thorn while loading your weapon. He looked directly at her. "It is over, Miss Holland, or should I say, whoever you truly are." The silence that followed Mr. Finch's accusation was absolute, heavier and more profound than the fog-bound quiet of the city outside. All the previous clamour and fear seemed to coalesce into a single point of stunned focus on the small, mousy woman in the corner. For a long moment, Miss Beatrice Holland did not move. She sat as still as a porcelain doll, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on Mr. Finch. The persona she had so carefully constructed, that of a timid, out-of-place missionary, was beginning to crack. Then something remarkable happened. She straightened her back. The terrified flutter in her eyes subsided, replaced by a calm, cold fire. The meekness fell away from her like a discarded cloak, revealing a core of tempered steel. When she finally spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. It was clear, steady, and carried the faintest, most elegant lilt of a language that had never been spoken in the English shires. "You are a very clever man, Mr. Finch," she said, her tone devoid of fear or remorse. "More clever than he ever was." She placed her knitting carefully on the table beside her. "My name is not Beatrice Holland." That was the name of a kind English woman who taught me her language and her Bible, but who could never quite extinguish the memories of my own people. "My real name is Anissa, and I am the daughter of the man General Fitzwilliam called the fanatic chieftain of the Kerinsai Valley." A wave of shock rippled through her audience. Lord Harrington looked as if he might faint. "My father was not a chieftain," Anissa continued, her voice resonating with a lifetime of suppressed grief and anger. "He was the Pungulu, the headman of our village, a keeper of our traditions. He was a man of peace." The uprising Fitzwilliam was so fond of describing was a protest against the men who came to steal our ancestral land for their rubber trees. Her eyes flickered for a second towards Lord Harrington. "Land that made families like yours wealthy. My father refused to yield, so Fitzwilliam and his soldiers came not to quell but to annihilate. He boasted of giving them a taste of British steel," she said, her lip curling with a contempt that mirrored Gideon Thorne's. "What he did was set fire to our homes while his men shot anyone who tried to flee. I was a child. I watched from the jungle where my mother had hidden me. I watched as Fitzwilliam himself confronted my father. My father had no weapon. Fitzwilliam shot him in the chest, and then he took my father's kris, a ceremonial dagger that had been in our family for generations, and cut the man's throat." Mrs. Vance let out a small, strangled sob, covering her mouth with her hand. The brutal reality of her husband's vague, horrified letters was being laid bare. "Fitzwilliam called it a trophy," Anissa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He called the massacre a damned fine piece of work. For 30 years I have lived with the memory of his laughter. I learned your language, your customs. I followed his career, reading of his promotions, his medals, his comfortable retirement. All while he was celebrated as a hero here in this club, which is nothing but a monument to men like him." She looked down at her hands. "I spent years planning. I discovered he was a member here. I forged a letter of introduction from a member I knew to be abroad. I learned his habits. I brought the poison with me from my homeland, extracted from the sap of the Antiaris toxicaria. The Epo tree, as Dr. Arbuthnot would know. The same poison my people once used for hunting, before your empire came to hunt us." The logic of her plan, so patient and precise, was breathtaking. "The book, Flora of the Malayan Peninsula, was to confirm the dosage," she explained calmly. "The blowpipe was my own creation, fashioned from a hollow reed I took from a decorative pot in the conservatory. It is small enough to be concealed in a sleeve." During his interminable story, when all attention was on him, it was a simple matter to raise my hand to my mouth, as if to stifle a cough and propel the dart into his neck. A tiny fleck of wood and poison. He barely felt it. It was the justice he denied my father. She had explained everything, the missing book, the motive that went deeper than anyone could have imagined, the ingenious, almost invisible murder weapon. The fire, a desperate attempt to retrieve the diary that could have unwittingly corroborated her presence in that same valley. The scratch on her hand was, as Mr. Finch deduced, from the poisoned tip. No one spoke. What was there to say? They were all implicated in her story. Lord Harrington by his family's blood-soaked profits. Mr. Thorne by the abstract evil he wrote about now made flesh. Mrs. Vance by the shared trauma of Fitzwilliam's brutality. Even the club itself, its panelled walls and portraits of governors, stood as a silent, proud accomplice to the crimes of the past. The echoes from the Empire had finally arrived in the heart of London, and they carried the sound of a debt being paid in full. Anissa stood up, her small frame imbued with an immense dignity. She was not a cowering murderer, but an executioner who had finally completed her life's work. There was a profound and terrible peace about her. It was at that moment that a new sound penetrated the muffled silence. Faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the shrill, insistent blast of a police whistle. Outside, the yellow gloom was beginning to recede. A grey, watery dawn was breaking, and the great beast of the London fog was, at last, releasing the city from its grip. The isolation was over. Rescue and the law were at hand. Lord Harrington sagged in his chair, a broken man whose world of certainties had been shattered. Mrs. Vance looked at Anissa, and in her eyes there was not horror, but a flicker of profound, sorrowful understanding. Mr. Alastair Finch, the quiet classics professor, felt no triumph in his victory of logic. He felt only a deep, abiding weariness. He had pieced together the puzzle of a murder, but in doing so, he had uncovered the far greater and far more intractable puzzle of human justice and the long, dark shadow of history. The doors of the club would soon be opened, but the ghosts that had been stirred this night would not be so easily exorcised.